Perfect day for some mate. We're in the middle of November, y'all, and somehow it is still like nice out, which is kind of scary, but it does have like a nice breeze going on, so just drinking my morning mate. Welcome to another video, guys, and today I'm going to be talking about 5 mistakes that native Spanish speakers make all the time. So let's hop right in. Okay, all of these mistakes I'm going to be talking about are things that I literally heard a native Spanish speaker say, and I thought to myself, like, I think that might be incorrect. And then I look it up and I realize, yes, that is incorrect. So these are all like real things that I've heard, that I've experienced. They're not just made up, and they're also not just like one-time mistakes. They're mistakes that Spanish speakers will make all the time, native Spanish speakers. A couple of them have to do with the subjunctive. So this first one that I'm about to talk about has to do with subjunctive in the present tense, specifically when you're making some sort of value statement, like if you're talking about something that you like or something that you think is interesting. If you make some sort of value statement like that, it's usually going to require you to use the subjunctive if you want to say it in a certain way. Let me just give you an example. So I was listening to a podcast and I heard a Spanish speaker say the phrase, "Me gusta que vienes siempre preparado." I like that you always come prepared, right? Me gusta que vienes siempre preparado. But guys, that's just incorrect if you look at the actual grammar rules of Spanish. And that's not just talking about the RAI, which is the Real Academia Española, which is kind of like an organization in Spain that like writes down grammar rules and stuff, but they're kind of controversial because a lot of people talk about how, it's very like Spanish-centered, very European-centered. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about how it's used in 90% of countries, the subjunctive, and also talking about the Real Academia Española and like how it's supposed to be used, entre comillas. But yeah, if you want to use the phrase, like if I want to say, I like that you always come prepared, I would need to use the subjunctive there. I would need to say, me gusta que vengas siempre preparado. Me gusta que vengas, because I'm making that like value statement about something that I like. Another example, if I wanted to say like, it's interesting that he called you. That's kind of a random phrase. I don't know why you'd want to say that, but it's interesting that he called you. So now we're talking in the past tense, right? He called you in the past. But I would hear a lot of Spanish speakers say something like, es interesante que te llamó, using that past tense there. But again, it's incorrect because saying, since you're saying it's interesting that's a value statement, and you've got to use the subjunctive there. You've got to say either es interesante que te haya llamado, or you could also say es interesante que te llamara, which is kind of more in English. It would be like it's interesting that he would call you in the past. But you can't say, or at least it would be grammatically incorrect to say es interesante que te llamó. Now, I want to say, specifically with this first error that I'm talking about, but also just with the video in general. Sorry, we're getting some garbage truck noises. Mate break. And something I want to mention about this point, and actually all of the points I'm going to talk about in this video, I think it's important to note that these are not like very important mistakes in the sense that it's never going to prohibit someone from understanding you, right? If you say vengas versus vienes, they're going to understand what you're trying to say regardless. So it's really not that important in terms of communication. I think it's really just important in terms of like showing you that even native speakers don't have perfect grammar, and just, kind of keeping you on your toes, making sure you're always aware and always thinking about stuff like that. Okay, the second error that you're going to hear native speakers make all the time also involves the subjunctive, and specifically the form of subjunctive that uses haber in the past. I don't remember the name of this grammatical structure where it's hubiera and habría. I forget grammatical names, but it's the structure you would use if you want to say something like, if you would have asked me, I would have helped you. Something like that, like something that could have happened in the past, but it didn't. You have to use the verb haber, and you have to use hubiera and habría. And it kind of goes like this. Si me hubieras preguntado, o si me hubieras pedido, te habría ayudado. Te habría ayudado. So like in that first clause, I use hubiera, if you would have helped me, or if you would have asked me. Te habría ayudado. I would have helped you. 2 different conjugations of that verb haber. One is that subjunctive in the past, hubiera, and the other one is the conditional, like would have, which is habría. This is confusing because in English you use would for both of them. If you would have asked me, I would have helped you, right? But in Spanish, there are those two different conjugations of the word have, would have. So yeah, the mistake that you'll hear with this is Spanish speakers, for both clauses, no matter the order or the sentence, they'll use hubiera. So they overuse that word hubiera and they don't use habría. So they'd say something like, si me hubieras pedido, te hubiera ayudado. En vez de decir, te habría ayudado. Dicen, te hubiera ayudado. You see the difference? This is kind of like an advanced Spanish thing, so if you're still a beginner, if you're still learning these conjugations and stuff, don't worry about it, but just keep it in mind. And if you're a more advanced Spanish speaker, surely this is something you've heard before because it's super common. Spanish speakers of all different countries just overuse this word hubiera and not do the correct conjugation of hubiera and habría. Again, I don't remember all the exact grammatical terms for these things, and I'm also not great at explaining it because I'm still kind of getting a grasp of these things myself. But if you're interested, you can look up more about that conjugation. Okay, I'm going to talk about number 3 now, which has to do with using the word de when it's not necessary. I think this is most common in Central American Spanish. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, please. But there's actually a name for it too. But I don't remember grammatical names or names of these terms. But there's a name for when Spanish speakers will insert the word de, like de, de. When it doesn't need to be there. And I'll give you an example. If I want to say like, you know that I don't like coffee, which isn't true. The way I'd say that is, sabes que no me gusta el café. Sabes que no me gusta el café. But a lot of times when you have that que, sabes que, or like any verb que, a Spanish speaker will put like a de before the que, and it'll sound like sabes de que. Sabes de que no me gusta el café. And that de there is just unnecessary. Although I will say, like, when you say it, when you actually speak it, I won't lie, like, it flows. It sounds good to me. Maybe it's just because I'm used to hearing it, but grammatically, that they there is not necessary, and it's not grammatically correct. Another example would be, did you hear that they got married? Escuchaste que se casaron. Escuchaste que se casaron. That's how you would say it. Did you hear that they got married? But a Spanish speaker who makes this error might say, escuchaste de que se casaron. Escuchaste de que se casaron. They put that de in there. So again, it's a super small error, does not affect communication in the slightest, or doesn't change the meaning of the sentence really. Although I did want to mention one time that it does change the meaning of the sentence with the verb deber. There's the phrase deber and deber de, and they mean slightly different things. One means like should, and one means must, which pretty similar in English. But if you wanted to say something like, you should study for the exam, you would say, debes estudiar para el examen. But a Spanish speaker who makes this error might say something like, debes de estudiar para el examen. And in Spanish, that's actually going to have a slightly different meaning that the Spanish speaker might not intend for it to have. But debes de, or using that structure of deber de, is more like must. Like an example would be, an example of when I would actually use that deber de, that structure, and where it would be grammatically correct is if I wanted to say like, you must be tired after work. Debes de estar cansado después del trabajo, right? So debes de estar is like you must be, versus giving like a recommendation like you should be tired after work. If I say it like that, it's more of a recommendation, and that would be debes estar cansado versus debes de estar cansado. Again, just a slight difference, and if like that was not a good explanation, that explanation that I just gave. So if this is a concept that's new for you, please like look up deber versus deber de, and find a better explanation, because in this video I'm not going to be giving good grammatical explanations. I'm just going to be pointing out some of these errors that you also might have heard before. Okay, but I'm going to jump up to number 4, which has to do with false friends. So you've probably heard of false friends before, also called false conjugates. Is that the word? False conjugates? Words that sound like they should mean one thing but actually mean another. And there's a ton of common examples that English speakers will mess up all the time. One of them is like actual, which, you know, does not mean actual like it does in English. It means currently. So like, oh, es mi trabajo actual means like it's my current job. And a lot of these are things that like only angloparlantes, only English speakers will mess up.
But then there are some false friends that I want to mention here that even native Spanish speakers mess up all the time. And I have a list of them here that I want to talk about. The first one is introducir. So the verb introducir sounds like introduce, right? But it does not mean introduce like it does in English. It means like to put something into, which is another way of using that word introduce in English, but it's not as commonly used, right? Usually when we say introduce in English, we're talking about introducing one person to another, something like that. And to say that in Spanish, you would have to say presentar, like te presento a mi amigo Jose, like I'm introducing you to my friend Jose. But the verb introducir in Spanish is not used as much because it's more of a technical word talking about putting one thing into another. Another example of a false friend that you're going to hear a lot from Spanish speakers that's just incorrect is the verb asumir, which sounds like assume in English. Assume has multiple meanings in English. It could mean like to assume something, as in like don't assume, you know, don't be assumptuous, don't assume. But it also has the meaning of like assuming a certain role or responsibility, assuming a duty, right? In Spanish, it only has that second meaning. When you use asumir in Spanish, it's only referring to assuming some sort of responsibility, some sort of role. But people will use it the other way too. They'll say, no asumas, don't assume. ¿Por qué estás asumiendo? Like, why are you assuming that? But it's not used that way in Spanish, or at least that's not the definition of the word. It's an anglicismo. It's like a word that comes from English that has sort of adopted this other meaning in Spanish, but is technically, again, speaking on technical terms, incorrect. So be careful of that one. The other one you've got to be really careful of is billón. Billón. B-I-L-L-O-N. It sounds like billion, right? It is a number, and that's the confusing thing about this word is it is a number in Spanish, but it's not a billion. It's a trillion. So I heard this error made on a Spanish podcast I was listening to where they were talking about the Olympics, and they said in the podcast, yeah, Paris has spent billions of dollars. París ha gastado billones de dólares en las Olimpiadas, which if you translate it correctly, that would be they've spent trillions of dollars. A, that's incorrect. B, I don't think that's what they were trying to say. I think that those Spanish speakers in the podcast were trying to say that they were spending billions of dollars. Now, if you want to say that in Spanish, a billion, you have to say 1,000 millones. So if they were trying to say that Paris spent billions of dollars on the Olympics, they would have had to have said, París gastó 1,000 millones de dólares. Billions of dollars, 1,000 millones. But by saying billones, they're really saying trillions. So again, these false friends can be confusing sometimes, but hopefully that makes sense, how that's an error that's really common even among native speakers. And then the last one I want to talk about is aplicar. Again, kind of similar to when I talked about asumir. This word aplicar or apply in English has multiple meanings, right? You could apply for a job or you could apply makeup. Now in Spanish, aplicar is just used for that second example. Aplicar maquillaje, for example, is to like put something on something else, to apply something. But it's not used for like applying to a job or applying to like some sort of position, something like that. For that, you'd have to use solicitar, the verb solicit, like to solicit employment. That's what you would use in Spanish. Acabo de solicitar a un nuevo trabajo. I just applied to a new job. If you use the verb aplicar, like acabo de aplicar a un nuevo trabajo, eso sería incorrecto, totalmente. Así que ten mucho cuidado con eso. With all of these false friends that I told you guys. Introducir, asumir, billón, and aplicar. Ten mucho cuidado. Okay, and then the last thing I want to talk about, it's more of a sentence structure thing, and it has to do with the verb gustar, or also like encantar, different verbs that are reflexive like that by nature. The best way to explain it is just to give you guys the sentence that I heard. So the sentence that I heard from someone is, hay muchas personas en Boston que les gusta correr. There's a lot of people in Boston that like to run, right? Hay muchas personas, or hay mucha gente en Boston que le gusta correr. Es incorrecto. Y déjame explicarte por qué. In Spanish, when you have this reflexive verb, you need, again, I'm going to forget the exact grammatical terms for this, so it's better if I just give you the actual examples instead of saying like the direct object, the blah, blah, blah. But you can't say las personas que les gusta. You have to say las personas a las que or a quienes les gusta. You have to have that object in there. So the correct way to say there's a lot of people in Boston that like running would be, hay muchas personas en Boston a quienes les gusta correr. Or I could say, hay muchas personas en Boston a las que les gusta correr. But I couldn't just take out that object. It would be incorrect and this is what I heard from a native Spanish speaker, but it would be incorrect to say, hay muchas personas en Boston que les gusta correr. That would be incorrect. And I'll give you one more example of this. Another sentence that I actually heard recently from a Spanish speaker. They said, es una audiencia que nosotros no tenemos ningún contacto. And if you understood what I said there, you'd understand the sentence too. It's an audience that, or like a fan base, an audience that we don't have a lot of contact with. Es una audiencia que nosotros no tenemos ningún contacto. And it's the same type of error where they forgot to, in this case, they forgot to insert a preposition. I think it's a preposition. It's called with, right? With is a preposition. They forgot to insert that before the verb. So it should be, es una audiencia con la que nosotros no tenemos ningún contacto. Con la que. If you were to translate that more literally into English, it would be, it's an audience or a fan base with which we don't have any contact. In English, it's a little bit easier because you can just say, it's an audience that we don't have any contact with. And you can put that with at the end. It's an audience we don't have any contact with. But in Spanish, you can't do that. And so I think this happens especially for Spanish speakers that also speak English, is they'll start to produce the sentence as if it was English, and then they kind of get to the end of the sentence and realize they can't just add that con at the end, and so they just leave it be, but technically is incorrect. So yeah, those are the 5 errors, guys. I hope this video wasn't too confusing. I realized that the fact that I actually don't have all of the names of those grammatical things memorized probably made this video a little more confusing than it needed to be. But hopefully the fact that I gave you a lot of different examples helped out. And again, the point of this video is just to show you that native speakers make errors all the time, and it's okay. I make errors all the time when I'm speaking English, my native language. Totally normal. And just be on the lookout for that sort of stuff, and don't worry too much when you make an error because, again, it's totally normal. Let me know in the comments what other errors you've heard native Spanish speakers make. I'd be interested to know. Thanks, and see you in the next one.